The morning sun cast no warmth over Cedar Ridge as Clara Boone stepped out of the jailhouse into the bitter December cold. Her bare feet sank into the fresh snow, leaving crimson trails where the ice cut through her skin. The woolen dress, once her Sunday best, now hung loose on her frame, still damp from the stone cell's moisture. In her arms, wrapped in what remained of her wedding veil, her infant daughter slept peacefully, oblivious to the fate that awaited them both. The gallows stood at the end of Main Street like a skeletal finger pointing toward heaven. Fresh lumber gleamed pale against the gray sky, the smell of pine sap mixing with smoke from morning fires. They'd built it just for her, the first woman to hang in Cedar Ridge, perhaps in all of Wyoming territory. Sheriff McKenna walked behind her, his boots crunching steady rhythm in the snow. He'd offered to carry the child, but Clara had clutched her daughter tighter, shaking her head. This would be their last walk together. She would carry her baby every step. The townspeople lined both sides of the street, their faces a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and something that might have been pity. Women pulled their children close, whispering behind gloved hands. Men removed their hats, though whether from respect or mere habit, Clara couldn't tell. She recognized most of them: Mrs. Patterson from the general store, old Henry Turner who ran the livery, the Carlson boys who'd helped build her husband's barn just 2 summers past. "Murderous!" someone hissed from the crowd. Clara didn't turn to see who. The word had followed her for 3 months now, ever since they'd found Tom Boone's body in the burned remains of their homestead, his skull caved in by what the prosecutor claimed was her cast-iron skillet. The baby stirred against her chest, making soft sounds that tore at Clara's heart. Little Mary was barely 4 months old, born into a world that had already turned cruel. Her tiny fingers emerged from the makeshift blanket, grasping at the cold air, and Clara tucked them back with practiced gentleness. "Shame," muttered Widow Henderson as they passed. "That poor child." Clara kept her eyes forward, focusing on the wooden platform ahead. Each step required concentration. The snow was deep, her legs weak from months of poor food and damp confinement. She stumbled once, and Sheriff McKenna reached out to steady her, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man about to watch her hang. The crowd grew thicker as they neared the gallows. Some had come from neighboring towns, drawn by the spectacle of a woman's execution. Clara spotted Judge Morrison on the platform, his black robes flapping in the wind like crow's wings. Beside him stood Reverend White, Bible clutched to his chest, lips moving in what might have been prayer. And there was the hangman, brought in from Cheyenne, a thin man with hollow cheeks who kept his eyes downcast, checking and rechecking the rope that would soon circle her neck. Clara had heard he was paid $20 for each execution. She wondered if he charged extra for women, or if death paid the same regardless. As they reached the foot of the gallows, Clara paused. The 13 steps loomed before her, each one worn smooth by the boots of condemned men. How many had climbed these stairs before her? How many had left children behind? "Please," she said quietly, turning to Sheriff McKenna. "Let me hold her until—" The sheriff's weathered face showed a flicker of something human. "You can hold her until it's time, Mrs. Boone." Clara nodded, grateful for this small mercy. She began to climb, her bare feet slipping on the icy wood. Behind her, the crowd pressed closer, their collective breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Someone was sobbing, a woman's voice, high and broken. Clara didn't look back to see who grieved for her, or perhaps for the child. At the top of the platform, the wind hit harder, cutting through her thin dress like knives. Mary began to cry, a thin wail that carried over the assembled crowd. Clara bounced her gently, humming a lullaby her own mother had sung years ago, before cholera took her, before Clara had married Tom Boone and learned what kind of man he truly was. Judge Morrison cleared his throat. "Clara Boone, you have been found guilty of the murder of your husband, Thomas Boone, The sentence is death by hanging, to be carried out this day, December 15th, in the year of our Lord, 1882. The words washed over her like cold water. She'd heard them before. In the courtroom where 12 men had decided her fate in less than an hour. No one had believed her testimony about Tom's rages, about the bruises hidden beneath her dress, about what he'd done to their firstborn son. Good men didn't beat their wives. They said good men didn't harm their own children. Tom Boone had been a good man. Everyone said so. The hangman approached with the noose. Up close. Clara could see his hands trembling slightly. She wondered how many women he'd hanged, if any. The rope looked freshly oiled, gleaming dully in the pale light. The condemned may speak her last words, Judge Morrison announced. Clara looked out over the crowd. So many faces. Most of them strangers now, though once she'd called some of them neighbors. She spotted Sarah Mills near the front, tears streaming down her cheeks. Sarah had been her friend once, before the trial, before suspicion poisoned every relationship. The baby had quieted, perhaps sensing the gravity of the moment. Clara kissed her daughter's forehead, breathing in her sweet scent, memorizing the weight of her small body. I stand here accused of taking a life, Clara began, her voice stronger than she'd expected. But I ask you, how many of you stood by while Tom Boone took the life of my firstborn? How many of you heard the cries in the night and turned away? A murmur ran through the crowd. Sheriff McKenna shifted uncomfortably beside her. I do not ask for your forgiveness, Clara continued. I ask only that you remember this child, innocent of any crime, who will grow up an orphan because this town values the life of a cruel man over the woman who finally found the courage to stop him. The wind picked up, sending snow swirling across the platform. Clara pulled Mary closer, feeling the rapid beat of her tiny heart. If she must grow up without a mother, Clara's voice broke slightly. Please tell her that I tried to stay. Tell her that everything I did so she would never know her father's fists. The crowd had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if nature itself held its breath. Clara saw several women crying openly now, and even some of the men looked away, unable to meet her gaze. It was then that a figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the crowd, a large man, broad-shouldered and weathered, walking with the careful gait of someone who'd seen battle. Malcolm Ridge, the blacksmith, a man of few words who'd kept to himself since returning from the war 17 years past. He pushed through the crowd with quiet determination, his eyes fixed not on Clara but on the child in her arms. When he reached the foot of the gallows, he stopped, removing his worn hat despite the cold. Judge Morrison, Malcolm's voice carried the rasp of disuse. I request a stay of execution. The judge frowned. On what grounds, Mr. Ridge? On the grounds that this child deserves a week more with her mother. On the grounds that perhaps this town should think harder about what we're about to do. The law has spoken. Mr. Ridge, the sentence must be carried out. Malcolm stood straighter, and for the first time, Clara saw why men stepped aside when he walked past. There was steel in him, forged in places darker than any courthouse. Then I invoke the territorial statute that allows for a week's reprieve if a citizen of good standing requests time to investigate new evidence. Judge Morrison's frown deepened. What new evidence? Give me a week, and I'll find it, Malcolm said simply. If I don't, I'll stand here myself and watch her hang. But give the child one more week. The crowd stirred, voices rising in discussion. Clara felt her legs weaken, whether from relief or simply the strain of standing. Mary began to cry again, hungry and cold. Judge Morrison looked to Sheriff McKenna, who shrugged. The town respected Malcolm Ridge, even if they didn't understand him. He'd never asked for anything before. 1 week, the judge said finally, but she returns to custody immediately. As they led her back down those 13 steps, Clara caught Malcolm's eye. She didn't know why he'd intervened. This man who'd barely spoken 10 words to her in all the years she'd lived in Cedar Ridge. But in his gaze, she saw something she hadn't expected. Not pity, not judgment, but a recognition of sorts. The look of someone who understood that sometimes the world broke people in ways that couldn't be explained to those who'd never been broken. The walk back to the jail seemed longer, though the crowd parted more readily this time. Some still muttered, "Murderous," but others were quiet, thoughtful. Clara heard whispers about Malcolm Ridge, speculation about what he might know, what evidence he might find. As they reached the jailhouse, Clara turned back once. The gallows still stood against the gray sky, patient and permanent. But for now, for one more week, it would wait. She held Mary closer and stepped back into the darkness of her cell, carrying with her the memory of Malcolm Ridge's steady gaze and the faint, impossible hope that somehow, in 7 days' time, the truth might finally matter more than the comfortable lies Cedar Ridge had told itself for so long. The wooden platform creaked beneath Clara's feet as Sheriff McKenna guided her up the 13 steps once more. A week had passed like the blink of an eye, 7 days that felt both endless and far too brief. The crowd gathered again, larger this time, drawn by curiosity about what Malcolm Ridge might have discovered. Clara scanned the faces below, but didn't see the blacksmith among them. Baby Mary lay quiet in her arms, wrapped in a new woolen blanket someone had left at the jail, soft and warm, embroidered with tiny yellow flowers. Clara didn't know who had brought it, but she was grateful. At least her daughter would be warm. Judge Morrison stood in his same position, the wind tugging at his black robes. The hangman waited beside him, rope in hand, though Clara noticed he kept his eyes fixed on the horizon rather than on her. Even he seemed affected by the week's strange reprieve. "The week has passed," Judge Morrison announced, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "Mr. Ridge has failed to appear with any evidence. We must proceed with the sentence." Reverend White stepped forward, his weathered Bible open to a marked passage. "Before we commence, the condemned is entitled to speak her final words and receive last rites." Clara looked out over the assembled townspeople. More women had come this time. She noticed. They stood in clusters, whispering behind gloved hands, their eyes moving between her and the child. She recognized Martha Sullivan, whose husband was known for his heavy fists. Beside her stood young Rebecca Marsh, barely 17, already bearing the haunted look of a woman who'd learned too young that marriage could be a prison. "Good people of Cedar Ridge," Clara began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I stand before you again, not to plead for my life. I know that is forfeit. But I speak now for those who cannot speak, for those who suffer in silence behind closed doors." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sheriff McKenna shifted uncomfortably beside her. "You knew Tom Boone as a respected rancher, a church-going man, a neighbor who'd lend his tools and share his harvest." Clara's voice grew stronger. "But I knew him as the man who broke my ribs while I carried our first child, who threw our baby boy against the wall when he cried too loud one night, who buried that same baby in secret and told everyone he'd died of fever." Gasps rose from the crowd. Several women pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths. "Lies!" someone shouted from the back. "Tom Boone was a good man." Clara continued, undeterred. "I speak not just for myself, but for every woman whose hidden bruises beneath her Sunday dress, for every child who's learned to stay quiet when Papa comes home angry. You hang me today for defending myself and my daughter, but my blood will be on the hands of every person who heard the screams and chose to do nothing." The wind picked up, sending snow swirling across the platform. Mary stirred in her arms, making soft sounds that carried in the cold air. Clara kissed her daughter's forehead, breathing in her sweet scent one last time. If this child must grow up without her mother, Clara's voice cracked, but she pressed on. If she must bear the shame of being the hangman's orphan, then I ask only this: tell her that I loved her more than my own life. Tell her that I tried to stay, tried to give her a world where she wouldn't have to fear the very man who should protect her." The crowd had fallen completely silent. Clara saw tears streaming down many faces now, not just the women's. Even some of the men looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Near the front, old Doctor Hartwell stood rigid, his face pale. He'd been the one to pronounce her firstborn dead, had accepted Tom's story of fever without question. Clara wondered if he was remembering now, reconsidering what he'd chosen not to see. "Enough," Judge Morrison said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "Reverend, proceed with the last rites." Reverend White stepped forward, but before he could speak, a disturbance erupted at the edge of the crowd. Malcolm Ridge emerged, but he wasn't alone. Beside him walked a small figure in black, Sister Catherine from the convent 30 miles north, known throughout the territory for her work with troubled souls. "Your Honor," Malcolm called out, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "I request you hear Sister Catherine before proceeding." Judge Morrison's jaw tightened. "Mr. Ridge, you've had your week. No evidence was presented." "Because I was fetching the sister," Malcolm replied. "She has testimony relevant to this case." The crowd parted as Sister Catherine made her way to the platform. Despite her small stature, she commanded respect. Even Judge Morrison seemed to shrink slightly in her presence. "Your Honor," Sister Catherine's voice was soft but carried clearly. 3 years ago, Clara Boone came to our convent seeking sanctuary. She carried a baby boy, barely alive, with injuries no infant should bear. We tended to him for 5 days before he succumbed." The crowd stirred, voices rising in shock and speculation. Sister Catherine continued. "She begged us to keep silent, said her husband would kill her if anyone knew. We prayed for guidance and ultimately sent her home, believing a wife's place was with her husband. That child's death has weighed on my conscience ever since." "This is hearsay," Judge Morrison protested, but his voice wavered. "I have the burial records." Sister Catherine produced a leather journal, and 2 other sisters who witnessed the child's injuries. We documented everything, as is our way. Clara felt her legs weaken. After all this time, someone was speaking the truth. Mary began to cry, perhaps sensing her mother's distress. "Furthermore," Malcolm Ridge stepped forward, "I've brought Sarah Mills, who has something to say." Sarah, Clara's former friend, climbed the platform steps slowly. Her face was pale, her hands shaking as she faced the crowd. I knew," Sarah whispered, then louder. "I knew what Tom Boone was. I heard the screams. I saw the bruises. We all did." She turned to face the crowd, tears streaming. "We all chose to look away because it was easier than admitting a respected man could be a monster." "I saw it too," another voice called out. Martha Sullivan stepped forward. "My own husband, Tom Boone, wasn't the only one. We've been cowards. All of us." More voices rose from the crowd, women stepping forward with their own testimonies. The careful facade Cedar Ridge had maintained for so long began to crumble like ice in spring. Judge Morrison raised his hand for silence. "These are serious allegations, but they don't change the fact that Clara Boone killed her husband." "Your Honor," Malcolm's voice was steady, "I've also been to the ruins of the Boone homestead. I found something the initial investigation missed." He produced a small object wrapped in cloth. A bullet, lodged in what remains of the doorframe. Tom Boone didn't just die from a blow to the head. Someone shot at him first. The question is, was Clara defending herself from a man who'd drawn his gun on her? The judge's face had gone gray. The comfortable narrative of the murderess and her victim was unraveling before the entire town. "This changes things," he said slowly. "Sheriff McKenna, return Mrs. Boone to custody. I'm calling for a new investigation and potentially a new trial." As they led her back down the steps, Clara caught Malcolm's eye. "Why?" she whispered as she passed him. "Because someone should have spoken up long ago," he replied quietly. Because that little girl deserves better than growing up believing her mother was a murderess. The walk back to jail felt different this time. The crowd didn't part in silence. Instead, voices rose in heated discussion. Some still condemned her, but others were questioning, reconsidering, facing uncomfortable truths about their own complicity. As they reached the jailhouse, Sister Catherine approached. "I'll stay in town," she said to Clara, "to testify at your new trial, and to care for the child if—" She didn't finish the sentence. Clara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. For the first time since that terrible night when she'd struck back at Tom in desperate self-defense, she felt something she'd thought lost forever. Hope. Not for herself, perhaps, but for Mary. For all the daughters growing up in Cedar Ridge who might now live in a world where someone would speak up when they heard screams in the night. The cell door closed behind her, but it no longer felt like a tomb. Outside, she could hear the town coming alive with difficult conversations long overdue. And somewhere in that noise was Malcolm Ridge's quiet presence. A man who'd waited until the last moment to act, but had acted nonetheless. Clara held Mary close, humming the old lullaby. The gallows still stood outside, patient and waiting. But for the first time, she dared to imagine it might wait forever. The judge's gavel struck hard against the wooden bench, silencing the crowded courtroom. "Given the new evidence presented, I hereby grant a 1-week postponement of the execution while a thorough investigation is conducted." Sheriff McKenna led Clara back through the snow-covered streets to the jailhouse. This time, the walk felt different. Some townspeople still glared with accusation, but others watched with something new in their eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or even shame. The jail cell welcomed her back with its familiar dampness and cold. Clara settled onto the thin straw mattress. Mary cradled against her chest. The baby had grown in the months since the trial, her eyes now focusing clearly on her mother's face, tiny fingers grasping with purpose. That first night of reprieve. Clara sat alone with her daughter, singing softly and trying not to think about how many more nights they might have together. The stone walls seemed to press closer in the darkness, and the winter wind howled through the barred window like a wounded animal. Near midnight, she heard footsteps in the corridor. Sheriff McKenna appeared with a lantern, followed by an unexpected visitor, Nellie Hutchinson, the blind woman who lived at the edge of town. Most folks called her Widow Nellie, though she'd never married. She made her way by weaving baskets and telling fortunes. Her clouded eyes said to see more than those with sight. "Mrs. Boone," Nellie's voice was soft as moth wings. "I've brought something for the child." She produced a small bottle of fresh milk, still warm, and a piece of clean cloth for feeding. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Mary hadn't had proper milk in 2 days. "Thank you," Clara whispered, taking the gifts with shaking hands. Nellie settled herself on the floor outside the cell, her gnarled fingers finding the bars. "I knew your mother, child, good woman. She'd be proud of how you've protected your baby." As Clara fed Mary, Nellie began to speak, her voice taking on the rhythm of a storyteller. She told of the old days, before the railroad came, when Cedar Ridge was just a handful of cabins along the creek. She spoke of women who'd survived Indian raids, harsh winters, and yes, cruel husbands too. "We've always been stronger than they knew," Nellie said. "But we learned to hide it, didn't we? Learned to survive by staying quiet. Maybe it's time that changed." The next morning brought another visitor. Malcolm Ridge stood outside her cell, hat in hand, a wooden cradle tucked under one arm. The cradle was beautiful, carved from pine, sanded smooth as silk, with small roses etched along the sides. "Figured the little one needed something better than that box," he said gruffly, not meeting Clara's eyes. Sheriff McKenna unlocked the cell to let Malcolm place the cradle inside. As he set it down, Clara noticed his hands, scarred from years of forge work, but gentle as they tested the cradle's balance. "Why are you helping me?" Clara asked. "You barely knew, Tom," You've no cause to involve yourself." Malcolm was quiet for a long moment, then spoke slowly. "Lost my wife in a fire, 15 years back. Always wondered if I could have saved her if I'd gotten home sooner. Can't change the past, but maybe I can keep another woman from dying when she shouldn't." He left before Clara could respond, but the cradle remained. Solid proof that someone in Cedar Ridge saw her as more than a murderess. The week passed in a strange rhythm. By day, investigators tramped through the snow to the burned ruins of the Boone homestead. By night, visitors came to the jail. Nellie returned each evening with milk and stories. Other women began to come too, slipping through the darkness to bring food, blankets, small comforts. Sarah Mills came on the third night, her face swollen from crying. "I'm sorry," she whispered through the bars. "I'm so sorry I didn't speak up at the trial. I was afraid. My own husband." "I know," Clara said simply. "We're all afraid." Sister Catherine visited daily, bringing not just prayers but practical help. Clean clothes for Mary, ointment for Clara's frostbitten feet, news from the outside world. She spoke of establishing a refuge for women in trouble, a place where they could flee when home became dangerous. "Your case has opened eyes," she told Clara. "Whatever happens, change is coming to Cedar Ridge." Malcolm came each evening after closing his shop. He said little, but his presence was steady as stone. He brought things: a thicker blanket, a small wooden toy for Mary, a Bible with pressed flowers between its pages. On the 5th night, he lingered longer than usual. "They found more at your homestead," he said quietly. "Bullets embedded in the walls, knife marks on the doorframe, signs of a struggle that went on for some time." Clara closed her eyes, remembering that terrible night, Tom coming home drunk again, but worse than usual. The wild look in his eyes when he'd accused her of hiding money, of planning to leave him, the way he'd grabbed for his gun when she'd tried to protect Mary. "The prosecutor's changing his stance," Malcolm continued. "Speaking of self-defense now instead of murder." "Will it matter?" Clara asked. "A woman killing her husband, even in self-defense." "It might," Malcolm said. "Times are changing, slowly but changing." On the 6th night, a storm blew in from the mountains. The wind howled like a living thing, and snow piled against the jailhouse walls. Clara huddled with Mary in their blankets, the cradle rocking slightly in the drafts that found their way through the stones. She must have dozed, because she woke to find Malcolm in the cell with her, Sheriff McKenna standing watch outside. Malcolm had brought a small oil stove, which he set up in the corner. "Can't have the baby freezing," he muttered, adjusting the flame, as warmth began to fill the cell. Clara found herself really looking at Malcolm Ridge for the first time. He was older than Tom had been, maybe 45, with silver threading through his dark hair. His face bore the lines of hard work and harder memories, but his hands were gentle as he adjusted the stove's wick. "You had no children?" Clara asked softly. "No," Malcolm replied. "Ellen wanted them, but they never came. Used to think it was a sorrow, but now, maybe it was mercy. This world's hard enough without watching your children suffer in it." "But you still think Mary should live in it?" Malcolm looked at the baby, sleeping peacefully in her carved cradle. "I think she deserves the chance to make it better, like her mother's trying to do." They sat in comfortable silence, the stove crackling between them. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cell, there was warmth and quiet companionship. "I've been thinking," Malcolm said eventually. "If they release you, when they release you, you'll need somewhere to go. Work to do. I need help at the forge. Nothing heavy, just keeping the books, managing orders. You write a fair hand, I've heard." Clara stared at him, unable to process the offer. People would talk, a widow working for an unmarried man. "Let them talk," Malcolm said firmly. "They've been talking anyway, haven't they? Might as well give them something new to gossip about." The 7th day dawned clear and cold. Clara woke to find a package outside her cell, a simple gray dress. clean and pressed, with a note, "For court, stand tall, the women of Cedar Ridge." She didn't know who had organized it, but as she changed from her worn prison clothes, Clara felt something shift. She wasn't facing this alone anymore. Whatever happened in court today, she had allies, people who'd found their courage, perhaps because she'd been forced to find hers. Malcolm came just before they transferred her to the courthouse. He carried something wrapped in brown paper. "For Mary," he said, handing it through the bars. "Whatever happens." Clara unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a silver locket on a delicate chain. She opened it to find 2 tiny photographs, one of herself, taken from the trial records, and on the other side, a pressed violet. "My wife loved violets," Malcolm said quietly. "Seemed fitting. New life from old sorrows." As Sheriff McKenna came to escort her to court, Clara clasped the locket around Mary's tiny neck. The baby grasped at it, gurgling happily, unaware of the gift's significance. "Thank you," Clara said to Malcolm, "for everything." "Don't thank me yet," he replied, "but I'll be there in court. We all will. You won't stand alone this time." And as Clara walked through the jail door into the bright winter morning, she believed him. The gallows still stood at the end of Main Street, but somehow it seemed smaller now, less inevitable. She had survived a week that had changed everything, not just for her, but for Cedar Ridge itself. The real test was yet to come, but for now, she had warmth, milk for her baby, and people willing to speak truth in a town built on silence. It was more than she'd dared hope for when she'd first climbed those 13 steps. The week stretched before Clara like a frozen river, each day flowing into the next with agonizing slowness. The investigation continued, but she remained in her cell, waiting. The small stove Malcolm had brought made the stone walls almost bearable, and the cradle he'd carved sat in the corner like a promise of normalcy in her decidedly abnormal world. Each morning began the same way. Mary would wake hungry, her cries echoing off the jail walls until Clara could comfort her with what little milk remained from Nellie's evening visits. The baby was growing despite their circumstances, her eyes brightening, her grip strengthening. Sometimes Clara would catch her daughter studying the play of light through the barred window, and her heart would clench at the thought of Mary's first memories being of this place. Sister Catherine arrived on the second morning of the extended wait, her arms full of supplies. "The church women have been gathering things," she explained, unpacking cloth diapers, a small tin of salve, and even a few toys. Mrs. Morrison, yes, the judge's own wife, sent these. Clara's hands stilled on the soft fabric. The judge's wife. "She came to confession yesterday," Sister Catherine said carefully. "Some secrets weigh heavy on the soul. It seems she's carried knowledge of Tom Boone's nature for some time. Her cousin worked as hired help at your ranch 2 summers ago." The implications hung in the air between them. How many had known? How many had chosen silence over justice? That evening, Nellie arrived earlier than usual, guided by Sheriff McKenna himself. The old woman's face was grave as she settled onto her usual spot outside the cell. "There's talk in town," she began without preamble. "Some folks aren't happy about the investigation. They say it's stirring up trouble, making good men look bad." "Tom's friends," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "Aye, led by Jack Sullivan and Pete Marsh. They've been drinking at Murphy's, talking loud about proper justice and women knowing their place." Clara instinctively pulled Mary closer. She knew those men. They ran in Tom's circle, shared his views on marriage and mastery. Pete Marsh was Rebecca's husband, and the thought of that young girl facing his anger made Clara's stomach turn. "Malcolm knows," Nellie added. "He's been keeping watch." The third day brought an unexpected visitor, Doctor. Hartwell stood outside her cell, his medical bag in one hand, hat clutched in the other. He looked older than she remembered, worn down by something more than years. "Mrs. Boone," he began. then stopped, seemingly at a loss. "I've come to... that is, I need to examine the child, for the court records." Clara hesitated, then nodded. Sheriff McKenna unlocked the cell, and the doctor entered with visible reluctance. His examination of Mary was thorough but gentle, his hands trembling slightly as he listened to her heart, checked her limbs, looked into her bright eyes. "She's healthy," he said finally. "Despite everything, you've kept her healthy." "I'm a mother," Clara replied simply. "It's what we do." Dr. Hartwell packed his instruments slowly. "Your son," he said quietly. "The one who died. I knew the fever story didn't match his injuries. But Tom was convincing, and I was a coward." "You were afraid," Clara said. "We all were." "No." The doctor shook his head. "You weren't. When it mattered most, you weren't." He paused at the cell door. "I'll be testifying at the new trial. The whole truth this time." Malcolm came that evening during the changing of the guard. When Sheriff McKenna stepped out for his dinner, the blacksmith brought something unusual. A book. "Thought you might want something to pass the time," he said, handing it through the bars. It was Ellen's favorite. Clara looked at the worn cover. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. She'd heard of it but never read it. Tom hadn't approved of novels for women. "Thank you," she said, running her fingers over the embossed letters. "Will you tell me about her? Ellen?" Malcolm settled onto the floor, his back against the wall. In the lamplight, the years seemed to fall away from his face. "She was small, like a bird," he began, "but fierce. Came out from Boston to teach school. Scandalized half the town by wearing bloomers and speaking her mind. I was working the railroad then, young and full of vinegar. Thought I was too rough for an educated woman like her." He smiled at the memory. "She proved me wrong. Said she didn't want a gentleman. She wanted a partner. We had 7 years together. Good years." "How did she die?" Clara asked softly. "Lantern got knocked over in the kitchen. I was at the forge, working late on a big order. By the time I saw the smoke, got there." His voice trailed off. "Found her by the door. She'd almost made it out." They sat in silence for a moment, both understanding the weight of almost. "I left for the war after that," Malcolm continued. "Figured if I was going to die, might as well make it count for something. But I survived. Came back here because, well, where else would I go? Been here ever since. Keeping my head down, working my iron." "Until now," Clara observed. "Until now," he agreed. "Seeing you up there with that baby, facing down the whole town, reminded me there are things worth standing up for." The fourth day brought troubling news. Sarah Mills arrived at dawn, her face bearing fresh bruises. "Jack found out I testified," she whispered through the bars. "He's furious. Says I betrayed Tom's memory, betrayed all of them." "You need to leave him," Clara said urgently. "Go to Sister Catherine." "With what money? Where would I go?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "At least you fought back. I don't have that kind of courage." But as the day wore on, something shifted in the jail. More women came, some openly, others sneaking in after dark. Rebecca Marsh arrived with her own set of bruises. Martha Sullivan with a split lip. They came seeking Nellie's wisdom, Sister Catherine's prayers, and something else, the strange comfort of being near Clara, the woman who'd done what they couldn't. "It's spreading," Sister Catherine murmured that evening. "Your defiance. It's spreading like fire through dry grass." The fifth day, Malcolm didn't come. Sheriff McKenna explained he'd been called to the courthouse for questioning. Clara tried not to worry, but his absence left a void in the evening routine. She read from the book he'd given her, finding strange parallels in Jane's story of surviving cruelty and finding her own strength. Near midnight, she heard commotion outside, raised voices, the sound of horses. Sheriff McKenna appeared at her cell, his face grim. "There's been trouble," he said. "Some of Tom's friends tried to burn down Malcolm's forge. He fought them off, but took a beating. Doc's with him now." Clara gripped the bars. "Is he—" "He'll live, tough as the iron he works. But Mrs. Boone, this is getting dangerous. These men won't stop at property damage." The sixth day dawned with news that shook the town. Pete Marsh had been arrested for beating his wife near to death. Rebecca had finally fought back. And when he'd overpowered her, she'd screamed loud enough to bring the neighbors running. For the first time in Cedar Ridge history, a man sat in jail for harming his wife. "It's your doing," Nellie said that evening. "You've awakened something that's been sleeping too long." Clara looked at Mary, peaceful in her cradle. "I just wanted her to be safe." "Sometimes making one person safe means making everyone safer," Nellie replied. "Change comes hard, but it comes." The seventh day of waiting arrived with a snowstorm. The wind howled around the jailhouse, and drifts piled against the walls. Clara woke to find Malcolm standing outside her cell, one arm in a sling, his face bearing the marks of his fight. "You shouldn't be out in this," she said, noting how he favored his left side. "Wanted to bring you this," he said, producing a small package. Inside was a tiny dress, store-bought and finer than anything Clara had owned. "For Mary, for court tomorrow." "Malcolm, the whole town's going to be watching," he said firmly. "That little girl deserves to look her best when her mother walks free." "You don't know that I'll walk free." "I do," he said with quiet certainty. "Because if they try to hang you now, they'll have a riot on their hands. You've changed things. Clara changed all of us." That evening, the jail was busier than ever. Women came in a steady stream, bringing food, prayers, and encouragement. Even some men appeared. Dr. Hartwell, Reverend White, others who'd found their conscience at last. As the sun set on her last night of waiting, Clara sat in her cell surrounded by evidence of community she'd never expected. The cradle Malcolm had made, the blankets the women had brought, the milk Nellie faithfully delivered, the book that connected her to a woman she'd never met but who'd also refused to be broken. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she whispered to Mary, "know that you're loved. Not just by me, but by people brave enough to stand up when it mattered." The baby gurgled in response, reaching for the locket around her neck, and Clara allowed herself to hope that tomorrow, the violets Malcolm had pressed in that locket might finally bloom into the new life they all desperately needed. The blizzard struck Cedar Ridge with the fury of a wounded beast. By noon, the snow fell so thick that buildings across the street vanished into white obscurity. The wind screamed through every crack and crevice, and the temperature plummeted until even the jail's stone walls offered little protection from the cold. Clara huddled in her cell with Mary, both wrapped in every blanket the women had brought. The small stove Malcolm had provided struggled against the storm's fury, its flame flickering dangerously low as drafts found their way through the barred window. "This is bad," Sheriff McKenna muttered, peering out the front door. "Worst storm I've seen in 20 years. Court won't convene tomorrow if this keeps up." By evening, the situation had grown dire. The stove had died completely, its oil frozen in the line. Mary's cries grew weaker as the cold seeped into their bones. Clara held her daughter close, trying to share what little warmth her body could provide, but she could feel her own strength failing. It was then that Malcolm arrived, covered in snow like some creature from a fairy tale. He pushed through the door with Sheriff McKenna's help, dragging something behind him, a large buffalo robe and a basket of hot coals from his forge. "The whole town's freezing," he said through chattering teeth. "Pipes bursting, folks trapped. We need to move her." Sheriff McKenna shook his head. "I can't release a prisoner, storm or no storm." "Then you'll have 2 corpses come morning," Malcolm said bluntly. "That baby's lips are already blue." Clara watched this exchange through increasingly heavy eyelids. The cold had settled into her bones like lead, and Mary had stopped crying altogether, a silence more terrifying than any scream. There's another option, Malcolm continued. My house is just behind the forge. Stone walls, good fireplaces. I'll take responsibility for her. Post a guard if you must, but get them out of this icebox. Sheriff McKenna wrestled with the decision, duty warring with humanity on his weathered face. Finally, the sound of Mary's labored breathing decided him. God help me, he muttered. All right, but you're responsible. Ridge, she runs. It's on your head. Malcolm wrapped Clara and Mary in the buffalo robe while Sheriff McKenna found rope to tie a guideline between buildings. The moment they stepped outside, Clara understood the sheriff's reluctance. This wasn't just a storm. It was a white death, eager to claim anyone foolish enough to venture into its embrace. They moved in a stumbling line through the blizzard, Sheriff McKenna leading, Clara in the middle clutching Mary, Malcolm behind her with one arm around her waist to keep her upright. The wind tried to tear them apart, snow blinding them until even the rope seemed to disappear. Clara's bare feet, she'd never received proper shoes in jail, went numb within seconds. Just when she thought they were lost, doomed to freeze mere yards from shelter, a door appeared out of the white. Malcolm shouldered it open, and they tumbled into blessed warmth. The house was simple but solid, clearly a bachelor's dwelling but well-maintained. A fire roared in the stone fireplace, and oil lamps cast golden light over sparse but quality furniture. Everything spoke of a man who lived quietly but with dignity. Ellen picked this spot, Malcolm said, guiding Clara to a chair by the fire. Said the forge would keep one side warm and the fireplace the other. She was right, as usual. Sheriff McKenna hovered uncertainly by the door. I should stay. Go home, Bill, Malcolm said firmly. Your own family needs you in this storm. I give you my word, she'll be here when it clears. After the sheriff left, Malcolm busied himself making the space comfortable. He brought thick wool socks for Clara's frozen feet, heated milk for Mary on the stove, and pulled a proper bed close to the fire. This was Ellen's sewing room, he explained, showing Clara to a small chamber off the main room. Haven't changed much since, well, the bed's good, and it's warm. Clara sank onto the bed, still clutching Mary. The baby had begun to pink up in the warmth, her breathing easier. Malcolm, I don't know how to thank. No thanks needed, he cut her off gently. Just get warm, rest. We'll worry about tomorrow when it comes. As the storm raged outside, Clara found herself in a strange bubble of peace. She bathed Mary in warm water Malcolm heated, dressed her in the fine dress he'd brought for court, and fed her milk that wasn't cold for the first time in months. The simple domestic acts felt like miracles. Later, as Mary slept peacefully in a drawer Malcolm had lined with soft blankets, Clara ventured back to the main room. Malcolm sat by the fire, working oil into a piece of leather despite his injured arm. Can't sleep either? He asked without looking up. Clara settled into the opposite chair. Every time I close my eyes, I see the gallows. Natural enough. He set aside his work. I had nightmares for years after Ellen died, still do sometimes. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the storm batter the walls. The house creaked but held firm, built to withstand worse than this. Why did you really help me? Clara asked eventually. The truth this time. Malcolm considered the question, his gaze fixed on the fire. First time I saw you was 3 years ago. You were at the general store with your boy, the one Tom killed. He was fussing, and you were bouncing him, singing some little song. You looked tired, scared, but gentle with that baby. So gentle. He paused, remembering. Then Tom came in, grabbed your arm hard enough to leave marks, told you to shut the brat up. You went white as paper, but you didn't cry, just held that baby tighter and walked out with your head up. Clara's throat tightened. She barely remembered that day. It had blended into so many other moments of fear and small defiances. I should have said something then, Malcolm continued. Should have stepped in, but I told myself it wasn't my business. Kept telling myself that right up until I saw you on those gallows steps. He finally met her eyes. Couldn't let another woman die because I stayed quiet. The wind howled louder, and somewhere in the house, something crashed. Malcolm rose to investigate, returning with a rueful expression. Shutter came loose. Fixed it, but this storm's not letting up anytime soon. What about court tomorrow? Won't be any court if this keeps up. Half the town will be digging out for days. He added another log to the fire. Might be a blessing. Gives folks more time to think about what really matters. As if summoned by their conversation, a pounding came at the door. Malcolm opened it cautiously to reveal Sister Catherine, supported by 2 younger nuns, all 3 looking like snow sculptures come to life. The convent roof partially collapsed. Sister Catherine gasped. We've been evacuating everyone to sturdy buildings. Is there room? Of course, Malcolm said immediately, ushering them in. How many? 6 sisters and 3 women who were sheltering with us. Sister Catherine's eyes found Clara, including Rebecca Marsh. Her husband's friends came looking for her at the convent before the storm hit full force. Over the next hour, Malcolm's house transformed into a makeshift refuge. Women arrived in small groups, guided by rope lines and determination. Rebecca came with Martha Sullivan, both bearing the marks of their husband's anger. 2 younger nuns Clara didn't recognize. Even Nellie appeared, led by Sarah Mills, both women clutching each other against the wind. Malcolm gave up his bed to the injured, made pallets on the floor, and somehow produced enough food to feed everyone. His movements were efficient, practiced, a man who'd dealt with crisis before. Army habits, he explained when Clara commented. You learn to make do, make space, make sure everyone survives the night. As the house filled with women's voices, something beautiful happened. The fear that had defined so many of their lives began to thaw like ice in spring. Rebecca, barely 18 and pregnant with her violent husband's child, found herself comforted by Martha, who'd survived 20 years of the same. The nuns shared their own stories of why they'd chosen the convent over marriage. Even Nellie spoke of the man she'd loved and lost, and why she'd chosen to remain alone rather than risk another brutal union. Look at us, Sarah said wonderingly. All these years living in the same town, suffering in silence, and it took a blizzard to bring us together. It took Clara, Sister Catherine corrected gently. She showed us we didn't have to suffer alone. Clara shifted uncomfortably at being the center of attention. I just did what I had to for Mary. That's what courage is, Malcolm said from where he was tending the fire. Doing what you have to when it matters most. As the night wore on, the storm began to ease. The wind still howled, but with less fury. Snow continued to fall, but gently now, like a blanket settling over the world. Near dawn, Mary woke hungry. As Clara fed her daughter, surrounded by women who'd risked everything to escape their own gallows, she realized something profound had shifted. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all of them. Every woman who'd been told her life mattered less than a man's anger. What happens when the storm ends? Rebecca asked quietly. They'll come looking for us, our husbands, the law. Then we stand together, Sister Catherine said firmly. The church will provide sanctuary, and I suspect we'll find more allies than enemies when the snow clears. Malcolm, who'd been dozing in his chair, stirred. I've been thinking, he said slowly. That building next to my forge, been empty since the assayer left town. Good solid structure. Could be converted into something useful. A boarding house, maybe. Place for women who need somewhere safe to stay. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. A refuge. A legitimate business that could provide shelter and income for women escaping dangerous situations. I could run it, Sarah said tentatively. I managed my father's inn before I married. We could all help, Martha added. Cook, clean, 10 children. As plans began to form, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years, hope backed by action. This storm had trapped them, yes, but it had also freed them. Forced together by necessity, they discovered their collective strength. Outside, the blizzard finally exhausted itself. Pale dawn light filtered through frost-covered windows, revealing a world transformed by white. Cedar Ridge lay buried but not broken, waiting to dig itself out and face whatever came next. And in Malcolm Ridge's simple house, a revolution disguised as refuge took its first breath, as quiet and certain as a baby's heartbeat in her mother's arms. The courthouse had never seen such a crowd. 3 days after the blizzard, with streets barely cleared and snow still piled high against buildings, it seemed all of Cedar Ridge had squeezed inside. Those who couldn't fit pressed against the windows, their breath fogging the glass as they strained to witness history. Clara sat at the defendant's table, Mary quiet in her arms. The fine dress Malcolm had bought for the baby seemed almost too bright against Clara's plain gray dress around her neck. Mary wore the locket, its silver catching the light from the tall windows. Judge Morrison looked older than he had just weeks ago, the weight of unfolding revelations etched in new lines on his face. Beside him sat 2 territorial judges brought in to ensure fairness, stern men who'd arrived on the first train after the storm cleared. The prosecutor, Mr. Dalton, had the uncomfortable look of a man whose certain world had crumbled. Across from him sat Clara's new attorney, a young man named Theodore Hartley, fresh from law school back east, who'd volunteered to take her case after hearing about it in Denver. "Your Honors," Hartley began, standing with the confidence of youth and righteousness. "We are here not merely to retry Clara Boone, but to examine how justice itself has been served in Cedar Ridge." The first witness was Sheriff McKenna, under questioning. He reluctantly admitted what the new investigation had uncovered. Tom Boone's cabin showed evidence of repeated violence, bullet holes in walls, knife marks in furniture, blood stains that had soaked deep into floorboards. "Why wasn't this discovered during the initial investigation?" Hartley pressed. McKenna shifted uncomfortably. We weren't looking for it. Tom Boone was a respected man. When we found his body, seemed clear enough what happened." "So you assumed guilt rather than investigating thoroughly?" "I suppose, yes." "Dr." Hartwell took the stand next, his testimony even more damaging. He spoke of treating Clara's injuries over the years, broken ribs, dislocated shoulders, wounds consistent with systematic abuse. His voice broke when he described the dead infant he'd examined 3 years prior. "The child had injuries no fever could cause," he said quietly. "I knew it then. God forgive me, I knew it and said nothing." Sister Catherine testified about Clara seeking sanctuary, about the dying babies she'd brought. The nuns had documented everything, their records painting a clear picture of prolonged domestic violence. But it was the parade of women's testimonies that truly shook the courtroom. Sarah Mills spoke of hearing screams. Martha Sullivan described seeing Clara's bruises at church. Rebecca Marsh, voice barely above a whisper, told of Tom Boone teaching her husband how to keep a woman in line. With each testimony, the mood in the courtroom shifted. Men who'd come to see justice served on a murderess began to look uncomfortable. Women who'd sat silent for years found their voices. Then came the revelation that changed everything. "Your Honors," Hartley announced. "We call Mrs. Constance Morrison to the stand." A gasp ran through the crowd. Judge Morrison's face went white as his wife made her way forward. She was a small woman, impeccably dressed, who'd never been known to speak publicly about anything more controversial than charity bazaars. "Mrs. Morrison," Hartley began gently, "would you tell the court what you told me yesterday?" Constance Morrison looked at her husband, then at Clara, and finally found her courage. "2 years ago, my cousin Emma worked as hired help at the Boone Ranch. She lasted only a month before fleeing in the night. She came to me, terrified, with stories of what she'd witnessed." "What did she witness?" "Tom Boone beating his wife with a leather strap. The baby, their first child, crying for hours while locked in the root cellar as punishment for disturbing his father. Clara begging for mercy and receiving none. What did you do with this information? Constance's voice dropped to a whisper. I told my husband, asked him to intervene. Every eye in the courtroom turned to Judge Morrison, who seemed to shrink in his chair. He said it was a private family matter. Constance continued. Said Tom Boone was a good man who knew how to manage his household. Said I shouldn't spread gossip. The silence that followed was deafening. Here was the town's moral authority, the man who'd condemned Clara to hang, revealed as complicit in the very violence that had led to Tom Boone's death. I have one more piece of evidence, Hartley announced. He produced a leather journal, water-stained but readable. This was found hidden in the ruins of the Boone cabin. It's Clara's diary. He began to read selected passages, Clara's own words painting a picture of escalating violence, desperate attempts to protect her children, and finally, the night Tom had killed their son. He said the baby cried too much, Hartley read. Said it was my fault for coddling him. When I tried to stop him, he hit me with the gun butt. When I woke, my baby was dead, and Tom was digging a hole behind the barn. He said if I told anyone, Mary would be next. Several women in the gallery began to weep. Even some men wiped at their eyes. The night Clara killed Tom Boone, Hartley continued. This is what she wrote. He came home drunk again, worse than usual. Said he decided Mary was too much trouble. Said he knew how to keep her quiet forever. When he went for his gun, I knew I had only seconds. The skillet was in my hand before I made the choice. But I did make it. God help me. I chose my living child over my dead husband, and I would make the same choice again. Hartley closed the journal. Your Honors, Clara Boone killed her husband. She has never denied this, but she did so to save her infant daughter from a man who'd already murdered one child. If that is not justifiable, if that is not the very definition of self-defense and defense of another, then justice has no meaning. The prosecutor made a half-hearted attempt at rebuttal, but his heart wasn't in it. The evidence was overwhelming. The tide of public opinion turned. When the judges retired to deliberate, the courtroom erupted in discussion. Clara sat quietly, holding Mary, aware that whatever happened, the truth was finally in the open. Malcolm had positioned himself where she could see him, a steady presence among the chaos. He'd testified too, simply and directly, about what he'd observed and why he'd acted. His reputation for honesty had weight even Judge Morrison couldn't dismiss. The judges returned in less than an hour. Mrs. Clara Boone, the senior territorial judge announced, in the matter of the death of Thomas Boone, we find you acted in lawful defense of yourself and your child. You are acquitted of all charges. The courtroom exploded. Women embraced, men argued, and through it all, Clara sat stunned, as if afraid to believe it was real. However, the judge continued, raising his voice over the din, this case has revealed serious failures in the administration of justice in Cedar Ridge. We are recommending a full territorial review of all domestic cases handled by this court. Judge Morrison started to protest, but the territorial judge silenced him with a look. Furthermore, Judge Morrison, you are hereby suspended pending investigation of judicial misconduct. Sheriff McKenna, you retain your position provisionally, pending retraining and proper investigative procedures. As people began to file out, arguing and exclaiming, Clara found herself surrounded by women. They touched her arms, whispered blessings, thanked her for courage she wasn't sure she possessed. Sister Catherine pushed through the crowd. The offer stands, she said. The convent will help establish a proper women's refuge. Mr. Ridge has already donated the building. Through the crowd, Clara saw Malcolm waiting by the door. He caught her eye and nodded once, then slipped outside. She understood. This was her moment, her victory. He wouldn't intrude on it. But as she finally made her way outside, breathing free air as a free woman for the first time in months. She found him waiting by the courthouse steps. "Where will you go?" he asked simply. Clara looked down at Mary, then out at the town that had nearly killed her and ultimately saved her. "I don't know. I have no home to return to. No family left." "The apartment above the forge is empty," Malcolm said. "It's small, but it's warm and safe. You could work for me, keeping books like I mentioned, until you figure out what comes next." Clara studied his face, this quiet man who'd risked his reputation and safety for a woman he barely knew. "Why? Malcolm? Really, why?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because everyone deserves a second chance at life. Ellen would have said that. Would have done what I did. Only sooner and better." He paused. "And because that little girl deserves to grow up seeing that sometimes good people stand up for what's right." Before Clara could respond, Rebecca Marsh approached tentatively. "Mrs. Boone? Clara, I was wondering. That is, Sarah and Martha and I were talking. If you're staying in town, maybe we could... That is, would you teach us?" "Teach you what?" "To be strong, to stand up, to protect ourselves and our children." Clara looked at the young woman's bruised face, at the hope warring with fear in her eyes. Behind Rebecca, other women gathered, some she knew, some strangers, all looking for something Clara wasn't sure she could provide. "I'm no teacher," Clara said slowly. "I just did what I had to." "That's what we need to learn," Martha said, stepping forward. "How to do what we have to when the time comes." Clara felt the weight of their expectations, heavier than any chains she'd worn. But then Mary gurgled in her arms, reaching for the locket that caught the afternoon sun. And Clara understood. She hadn't fought just for herself, or even just for Mary. She'd fought for all of them, whether she'd meant to or not. "All right," she said finally. "We'll learn together." As the crowd dispersed, Clara stood on the courthouse steps where just weeks ago she'd climbed toward the gallows. The same building, the same town. But everything had changed. The structure of power that had protected violent men and silenced suffering women had cracked. And through those cracks, light was beginning to shine. Malcolm touched her elbow gently. "Come on, let's get Mary home. The forge apartment isn't much, but it's yours as long as you need it." Home. Such a simple word for such a complicated gift. But as Clara walked beside Malcolm through the snow-covered streets, her daughter safe in her arms and the shadow of the gallows finally behind her, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could build something new from the ashes of what had been. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Clara stood with Mary in her arms, breathing the air of freedom around her. The crowd dispersed slowly, people talking in hushed groups about what they'd witnessed. Some looked at her with newfound respect, others with lingering suspicion. But Clara found she no longer cared about their opinions. She was free. Mary was safe. Everything else could wait. Malcolm stood nearby, patient as always, his presence a quiet anchor in the chaos. Sheriff McKenna approached them, hat in hand, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Boone," he began, clearing his throat. "Your belongings from the jail, and from your homestead. What's left of them? Anyway, where should I have them delivered?" Clara realized with a start that she truly had nowhere to go. The cabin she'd shared with Tom was burned ruins. She had no family left, no friends who could take her in without causing scandal for harboring a woman who, despite her acquittal, would always be known as the one who killed her husband. "The forge apartment," Malcolm said quietly. "Have everything sent there." McKenna nodded and retreated, clearly relieved to be done with the awkward conversation. As he left, other figures approached, Sister Catherine with her group of nuns, Sarah Mills supporting Rebecca Marsh, Martha Sullivan with her eldest daughter. They formed a protective circle around Clara, as if shielding her from the curious stares of passing townspeople. "We've been talking," Sister Catherine began. About the refuge. Mr. Ridge has generously offered the building, but we'll need someone to run it. Someone who understands what these women have been through. Clara shifted Mary to her other arm, the weight of the baby grounding her. I don't know anything about running a refuge. You know about survival, Martha said firmly. That's what matters. I need time, Clara said, feeling overwhelmed. To think, to settle somewhere first. Of course, Sister Catherine agreed. But know that when you're ready, we're ready too. As the women departed, each murmuring words of support or blessing, Clara found herself alone with Malcolm on the courthouse steps. The gallows still stood at the end of Main Street, but somehow it had lost its power. It was just wood and rope now, a symbol of a justice system that had failed but was perhaps beginning to change. It's a lot to take in, Malcolm observed. Everything's different, Clara said. This morning I was a condemned woman. Now they want me to lead them. I don't know if I'm strong enough for that. Strength isn't about not being afraid, Malcolm said. It's about doing what needs doing despite the fear. You've already proven you can do that. They walked slowly through town toward the forge, Clara noticing how people reacted to seeing them together. Some whispered. Others openly stared. A widow walking with an unmarried man just hours after her acquittal. The gossips would feast for weeks. This will cause talk, she said. Let them talk, Malcolm replied. They'll talk anyway. Always do. The forge stood solid and welcoming, smoke rising from its chimney. Behind it, connected by a covered walkway, was a modest wooden building. Malcolm led her up the exterior stairs to the apartment above. It's not much, he said, producing a key, but it's clean and warm. The apartment was indeed modest, 2 rooms with a small kitchen area, but the windows were large, letting in plenty of light, and someone had recently cleaned. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, and Clara recognized them as Ellen's work, carefully preserved all these years. I can't pay rent yet, Clara said. Not until... No rent, Malcolm interrupted. You'll earn your keep helping with the books, like we discussed. The forge does steady business. I need someone who can write a fair hand and figure numbers. Clara set Mary down on the bed, the baby immediately beginning to explore her new surroundings with curious hands. Why are you doing this, Malcolm? Really? He was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the town below. Maybe because I've been dead inside for 15 years, and watching you fight to live reminded me what that felt like. Maybe because it's what Ellen would have done, or maybe because it's just right. Before Clara could respond, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Sheriff McKenna appeared with 2 deputies, carrying a pitifully small collection of belongings. The clothes donated during her imprisonment, the wooden cradle Malcolm had made, a few items salvaged from the burned homestead. This is all? Clara asked, staring at the meager pile. Fire took most everything, McKenna said apologetically. But we found this. He produced a small metal box, smoke-blackened but intact. It was buried under the floorboards. Clara opened it with trembling hands. Inside were her mother's wedding ring, a few silver dollars, and, most precious of all, a daguerreotype of her parents from years before. She traced their faces with one finger, tears falling silently. After the sheriff left, Malcolm helped arrange the few possessions in the apartment. He worked quietly, giving her space to grieve what was lost while appreciating what remained. I should go, he said finally. Let you settle in. The forge opens early, but take whatever time you need before starting work. Malcolm, Clara called as he reached the door. Thank you for everything. I know it doesn't seem like enough to say, but... It's enough, he said simply. More than enough. After he left, Clara sat in the fading light with Mary in her lap, trying to comprehend how much had changed. This morning she'd awakened in a jail cell, condemned to die. Now she sat in a clean apartment with her daughter safe and a job waiting. It felt like too much grace for someone who'd taken a life. Justified or not, a soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Nellie Hutchinson, the blind woman navigating the stairs with surprising confidence. "Thought you might need some company your first night of freedom," Nellie said, producing a basket. "Brought supper. Nothing fancy, but it's hot." They ate together while Mary played with wooden spoons. The simple domesticity, a balm to Clara's raw emotions. Nellie told stories of Cedar Ridge in its early days, of other women who'd survived tragedy and rebuilt their lives. "You're not the first and won't be the last," Nellie said sagely. "This town's seen its share of strong women, just that most learned to hide it better than you did." "I didn't feel strong," Clara admitted. "I felt terrified every moment." "That's what courage is. Child. Being scared as hell and standing up anyway." As night fell, more visitors arrived. Sarah brought fresh milk for Mary. Martha delivered a stack of cloth for diapers. Even Rebecca, despite her own troubles, climbed the stairs to offer a small rag doll for the baby. "We want to help with the refuge," Rebecca said shyly. "All of us. We've been talking, planning. If you'll lead us." "I don't know how to lead anyone," Clara said. "I barely know how to survive myself." "That's why we need you," Sarah interjected. "You understand. You've been where we are." They talked late into the evening, planning tentatively. The building Malcolm offered could house 6 women and their children. Sister Catherine would provide spiritual support and help with supplies. Dr. Hartwell, chastened by recent events, offered free medical care. Even Sheriff McKenna, through Martha, had sent word that he'd support the refuge's work. After they left, Clara tucked Mary into the cradle Malcolm had made, running her fingers over the carved roses. Such beauty from hands that could also forge iron. She thought about Malcolm, about the quiet strength he'd shown, the risks he'd taken. He asked for nothing in return, expected nothing, but his steady presence had become something she relied on without realizing it. A sound from outside drew her to the window. Below in the forge, she could see light spilling from the windows, hear the ring of hammer on anvil. Malcolm working late, as was his habit. The rhythmic sound was oddly comforting, a heartbeat of productivity and purpose in the quiet night. Clara returned to Mary's side, checking on her sleeping daughter. The baby's face was peaceful, unaware of how close she'd come to being orphaned. The locket Malcolm had given her caught the lamplight, and Clara opened it again. Her own face stared back from one side, captured during the trial when she'd thought all hope lost. On the other, the pressed violet, still retaining a hint of purple despite its preservation. New life from old sorrows. Malcolm had said, perhaps that's what this was, not an ending, but a beginning. Not just for her, but for all the women gathering courage from her example. She thought of Tom then, for the first time in hours, not with hatred or fear, but with a kind of distant pity. What had made him so cruel? What twist of fate or upbringing had turned him into a man who could kill his own child? She'd never know. And perhaps it didn't matter. He was gone, and she and Mary remained. A gentle knock at the door surprised her. Malcolm stood there with an armload of firewood. "Thought you might need extra wood tonight," he said. "Gets cold up here when the wind blows." As he stacked the wood by the small stove, Clara watched him work. His movements were careful, favoring his injured arm from the fight with Tom's friends. He'd risked so much for her, this quiet man who'd kept to himself for years. "Stay a moment," she said impulsively. "Please, I don't want to be alone just yet." He hesitated, then nodded, settling into the single chair while she sat on the bed. They talked quietly, about nothing and everything, the forge business, the plans for the refuge, Mary's growth. Normal conversation between two people who'd been through extraordinary circumstances together. "I should let you rest," Malcolm said finally, rising to leave. Clara stood too, moved by an impulse she didn't fully understand. She reached out and took his hand, scarred from forge work, gentle despite its strength. "You saved our lives," she said simply, "mine and Mary's. I'll never forget that." Malcolm looked at their joined hands, then at her face. "You saved yourselves. I just made sure folks noticed." "No," Clara said firmly. "You gave me hope when I had none. That's not nothing." He squeezed her hand gently, then let go. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's a new day, and you'll need your strength for it." After he left, Clara prepared for bed in her new home. The apartment was simple, even spare, but it was hers. No one could burst through the door in a drunken rage. No one could hurt her or Mary here. The locks were strong, the walls solid. And downstairs, a good man worked late into the night, his presence a shield against the darkness. As she lay down beside Mary's cradle, Clara allowed herself to imagine a future, not a grand one. She'd learned the danger of too much hope, but a quiet life of purpose, working at the forge, helping establish the refuge, raising Mary in safety, and perhaps, though she hardly dared think it, something more with the quiet blacksmith who'd shown her that not all men dealt in violence and fear. The sound of Malcolm's hammer rang through the night, steady as a heartbeat, and Clara fell asleep to its rhythm. For the first time in years, she slept without nightmares, without fear. She slept like a woman with choices, with tomorrows, with hope. Tomorrow she would begin the work of building a new life from the ashes of the old. But tonight, she simply held her daughter's tiny hand and breathed in the sweet air of freedom, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together, supported by a community of women who'd found their voices and one good man who'd helped them remember they deserved to be heard. Spring came late to Cedar Ridge that year, but when it arrived, it transformed the town with unusual splendor. Wildflowers bloomed in profusion where snow had lain for months, and the cottonwoods along Main Street burst into leaf with vibrant green. It had been 3 months since Clara's acquittal, 3 months of building a new life piece by careful piece. On this particular morning, Clara walked through town with Mary on her hip, no longer feeling the weight of stares that had once followed her everywhere. The child had grown sturdy and bright-eyed, babbling constantly and reaching for everything within grasp. The locket Malcolm had given her still hung around her neck, catching the morning sun. They passed the old Gallows on their way to the forge. The structure still stood, but nature had begun to reclaim it. Vines wrapped around the posts, and birds had built nests in the crossbeam. No one had been hanged in Cedar Ridge since Clara's reprieve, and there was talk of tearing it down, of building something useful in its place, perhaps a schoolhouse or a park where children could play. At the forge, Clara found Malcolm already at work, the fire glowing hot as he shaped a horseshoe. She'd grown accustomed to the rhythm of his work, the ring of hammer on anvil that had once comforted her through dark nights and now simply marked the passing of productive days. "Morning," he said, glancing up with a small smile that had become more frequent over the months. "Ledgers are on the desk. Henderson's account needs settling, and we got a new order from the railway company." Clara had proven adept at managing the forge's books, bringing order to what had been Malcolm's haphazard system. The work gave her purpose and independence, allowing her to pay for her and Mary's needs without charity. She'd even managed to save a small amount, carefully hidden away for her daughter's future. As she settled Mary in the small play area Malcolm had built in the corner of the office, Sarah Mills arrived, breathless with excitement. "It's finished," she announced. "The refuge. Sister Catherine says we can hold the opening ceremony tomorrow." The women's refuge had taken shape quickly once word spread through the territory. Donations had come from unexpected sources: a wealthy widow in Denver, a mining company owner whose own sister had suffered in a violent marriage, even some of the local men who'd been shamed by the revelations of the trial. The building Malcolm had donated was now freshly painted, with sturdy locks, comfortable beds, and a kitchen garden already showing green shoots. "Will you speak at the ceremony?" Sarah asked Clara. As our founder, I'm not the founder, Clara protested, as she always did. We all built this together. But you're the reason it exists, Sarah insisted. None of us would have found our courage without you. Before Clara could respond, Rebecca Marsh entered, her infant son in her arms. She'd given birth a month after her husband's arrest, choosing to keep the child despite everything. The refuge had been her home since the day it opened its doors for testing, and she'd blossomed in safety, the haunted look leaving her eyes. Malcolm, Rebecca said shyly, I finished the sign you asked me to paint. Malcolm wiped his hands on his leather apron and went outside with the women. Above the refuge's door, Rebecca had painted in careful letters, Hope House, a haven for women and children. Below, in smaller script, founded in memory of those we've lost, in hope for those we can save. It's perfect, Clara said, her throat tight with emotion. Ellen would have liked it, Malcolm said quietly, and Clara knew the cost of those words. The grief he still carried but had learned to transform into something productive. That evening, as was their custom now, Clara and Malcolm shared supper in her apartment. It had begun as simple courtesy, him bringing food when he knew she was too tired to cook, and evolved into something more. Mary played at their feet while they talked about the day's work, the refuge's progress, the small dramas of town life. I've been thinking, Malcolm said, unusually hesitant. The apartment's getting cramped with Mary growing. The house has empty rooms, just sitting there gathering dust. Clara's hands stilled on her plate. They'd grown close over the months, but always with careful boundaries. She was a widow too recently bereaved. He, a man still mourning his lost love. The town watched them with knowing looks, but they'd maintain propriety. Malcolm. Not like that, he said quickly, color rising in his weathered cheeks. I meant, as tenants, proper rent, separate quarters, just more space for Mary to grow. Before the Clara could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see torches gathering in the street, angry voices rising. Clara's blood ran cold. She'd seen such gatherings before, when Tom's friends had tried to burn the forge. Malcolm was already moving, grabbing the rifle he kept by the door. Stay here. Lock the door behind me. But Clara recognized some of the voices below. These weren't Tom's old companions. Most of them had left town after the trial, finding Cedar Ridge suddenly inhospitable to men who ruled by fear. This was something different. It's Pete Marsh, she said, peering through the curtain. Rebecca's husband. He must have made bail. They could hear him clearly now, drunk and raging, demanding his wife be returned to him, claiming his rights as a husband. Other voices joined his. Not many, but enough to cause trouble. She's mine by law, Pete shouted. That refuge is harboring my legal wife. Clara made a decision. Watch Mary, she told Malcolm, then headed for the door. Clara, no. But she was already descending the stairs, stepping into the street to face the mob. The men fell silent as she appeared. This woman they'd once condemned to hang now standing before them with quiet authority. Pete Marsh, she said, her voice carrying clearly. Your wife sought sanctuary because you nearly killed her. You have no rights here. You, Pete spat, weaving drunkenly. You're the cause of all this, getting women to think they can just leave, stirring up trouble. The only trouble here is men who believe their wives are property. Clara replied, Rebecca stays where she chooses, and she chooses safety. Sheriff McKenna appeared then, with several deputies. The past months had changed him too. He'd taken his retraining seriously, working with Sister Catherine to understand the dynamics of domestic violence. Pete Marsh, the sheriff said firmly. You're violating your bail conditions by coming here. Let's go. Pete tried to resist, but his supporters melted away when faced with actual authority. As the deputies let him off, he shouted over his shoulder, This isn't over. A man has rights. So does a woman, Clara called back, including the right to live without fear. As the crowd dispersed, Clara found Malcolm beside her, rifle lowered but ready. "That was foolish," he said, but there was admiration in his voice. "Maybe," Clara agreed. But hiding never helped anyone. They walked back toward the forge together, and Clara made a decision. "About your offer," she said. "The house, I accept with conditions." Malcolm waited. "Fair rent, like you said, and I help with the housekeeping, earn our keep properly, and—" She hesitated, then forged ahead. "We take things slowly, see where they lead without forcing anything." "Agreed," Malcolm said simply. "Ellen always said I was too patient for my own good, but seems like patience might be what's needed here." The next morning brought the refuge's official opening. The entire town seemed to have gathered, including many who'd once stood silent. Judge Morrison's replacement, a younger man with progressive ideas, gave a speech about justice evolving to protect all citizens. Dr. Hartwell announced his donation of a year's medical services. Even some of the territorial legislators had come, interested in possibly funding similar refuges elsewhere. But it was Clara who drew the most attention when she finally agreed to speak. She stood before the crowd with Mary in her arms, the same woman who'd climbed the gallows steps just months before, now transformed into something else. Not a victim, not a martyr, but a survivor who'd chosen to make her survival mean something. "Hope House stands as proof that we're stronger together than alone," she said. "That silence in the face of suffering is complicity, that every woman deserves safety, every child deserves peace, and every person deserves the chance to build a better life." She paused, looking over the crowd, seeing the faces of women who'd found courage, men who'd found conscience, and a community that had chosen change over comfortable lies. "Some of you stood here months ago to watch me hang," she continued. "Today you stand here to witness something else, the birth of hope from the ashes of despair. This house will shelter those who need it, but more than that, it will stand as a reminder that we all have the power to choose compassion over cruelty, action over indifference." As she spoke, her eyes found Malcolm in the crowd. He stood quietly, as was his way, but she could see the pride in his expression. Later, she knew, they would move her few belongings into his house, beginning a new chapter whose ending she couldn't foresee. But for now, she simply spoke the truth that had set them all free. The ceremony concluded with Sister Catherine blessing the house and Rebecca cutting a ribbon across the door. The first official residents, a woman from a neighboring town with 2 small children, were welcomed inside. As people toured the facilities, exclaiming over the comfortable rooms and practical arrangements, Clara stepped aside for a quiet moment. She found herself standing near the old gallows, Mary babbling happily in her arms. The structure that had once represented death now stood wreathed in flowering vines, birds singing from the crossbeam. Someone had carved words into one of the posts. Here, justice failed, until mercy prevailed. Malcolm appeared beside her, following her gaze. "Want me to tear it down? I could have it gone in a day." Clara considered, then shook her head. "Let it stand a while longer. Let it remind us of what we almost lost, and what we chose instead." He nodded, understanding. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the town transform around them. Children played where crowds had once gathered for executions. Women walked freely where they'd once scurried in fear. Men like Sheriff McKenna were learning that strength didn't require dominance. "Ready to go home?" Malcolm asked eventually. Home. Such a simple word for such a complex journey. Clara thought of the house waiting for them, not just shelter, but the possibility of family, of love rebuilt from ashes, of a future neither of them had dared imagine. "Yes," she said, adjusting Mary on her hip. The baby reached for Malcolm with chubby hands, and he took her with practiced ease. The stern blacksmith transformed into gentle caretaker as they walked away from the gallows toward their new life. Clara allowed herself one last look back. The rope still hung there, swaying gently in the spring breeze, but it had lost its power. She'd faced death and chosen life, faced hatred and chosen love, faced silence and chosen to speak. The yellow ribbon in Mary's hair, the same one Malcolm had brought to the jail so many months ago, fluttered in the wind like a small flag of victory. They'd all survived the winter of judgment and emerged into a spring of possibility. Behind them, Hope House opened its doors to those who needed shelter. Ahead of them, Malcolm's house waited with its promise of quiet domesticity. And all around them, Cedar Ridge continued its transformation from a town that hanged desperate women to one that sheltered them. The gallows would come down eventually, Clara knew, but for now, it served its purpose, not as an instrument of death, but as a monument to survival, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope could take root and bloom, like violets in spring. Malcolm had said, "New life from old sorrows." As they reached the house, Malcolm paused at the door. "Welcome home," he said simply, and Clara understood he meant more than just the house. He meant the life they would build together, carefully and with respect for all they'd both lost. He meant the community they'd helped create. He meant the future stretching before them, uncertain but no longer fearsome. "Thank you," Clara replied, meaning more than just the house, too. Meaning the second chance, the patient courtship to come, the family they might yet become. Mary laughed, reaching for the door handle with eager hands, ready to explore her new world. And Clara, following her daughter's lead, stepped through the doorway into whatever came next, knowing that sometimes the greatest courage was simply choosing to begin again.